I am sitting in a high-rise apartment that my parents don't know I own, looking at a stack of legal documents that would make most people's heads spin. And I honestly have to ask you all, at what point does family stop being family and start being a pack of wolves? I lost the love of my life 6 months ago, and while I was still trying to remember how to breathe without him, my own mother and father were filing a petition with the court to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could seize control of the $4 million estate he left behind. They didn't do it because they were worried about my grief. They did it because they thought I was a weak, grieving widow who they could easily steamroll for a payday. But they forgot one very important thing. My husband was a high-stakes corporate attorney who taught me exactly how to document a betrayal before it even happens. So, before I tell you how I burned their plan to the ground in front of a judge, I need to know, if your parents tried to steal your late spouse's legacy while you were at your lowest point, would you ever speak to them again? Or would you do what I did and make sure they lost everything? Let's go back to the beginning so you can understand how we got to this point of no return. I met Julian 8 years ago, and from the second we met, he was my entire world. He was brilliant, kind, and incredibly successful, having built a specialized law firm from the ground up. My parents, on the other hand, have always been the type of people who view other people's success as a personal affront to their own mediocrity. My father, Marcus, went through 3 different business ventures that were really just ways to lose my mother's inheritance, and my mother, Alina, spent her life pretending we were part of the local elite while we were actually drowning in credit card debt. When I married Julian, they didn't see a son-in-law, they saw a walking ATM. For the first 5 years of our marriage, Julian was incredibly generous. He paid off their mortgage, he bought them a new car, and he even funded a consulting firm for my father that predictably folded within 18 months. Julian did it for me because he knew I wanted a relationship with them, but he wasn't a fool. About 3 years ago, he started noticing that the more he gave, the more they demanded, and the more entitled they became. They started making comments about how we were so lucky to have this money, and how the family should really be making decisions together about Julian's investments. One night, after a particularly exhausting dinner where my mother spent 2 hours complaining that her designer handbag was last season, while Julian was trying to talk about a pro bono case he was working on, Julian pulled me aside. He told me, "Honey, I love you, but your parents are predators. They don't love us. They love the lifestyle we provide. If anything ever happens to me, I need to know you're protected from them." At the time, I thought he was being a bit paranoid. I mean, they were my parents. Sure, they were greedy, but surely they wouldn't actually hurt me. Regardless, Julian insisted on setting up a series of legal safeguards. He moved the majority of our assets into a very specific type of trust, and most importantly, he had me go through a full psychological evaluation and a capacity check with a third-party professional every year as part of our estate planning. He told the doctors it was for insurance purposes regarding his firm, but he privately told me it was a paper trail to prove I was of sound mind, just in case anyone ever tried to challenge my inheritance. He even recorded several video depositions with our family lawyer, stating explicitly that he wanted me to have sole control, and that my parents were to receive nothing more than a small monthly stipend, which would be immediately revoked if they ever attempted to contest the will. Then the unthinkable happened. Julian was involved in a multi-car pileup on his way home from the office. He survived for 3 days in the ICU, but the brain trauma was too severe. When he passed, my world ended. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I spent weeks in a daze of funeral arrangements and suffocating grief. During those first few weeks, my parents were there every day. At first, I thought they were finally being the parents I needed. My mom was making tea, my dad was handling the mail, and they were constantly telling me to just rest and let them handle the details. I was so blinded by pain that I didn't see what they were actually doing. They weren't handling details, they were hunting. They were looking for account numbers, property deeds, and the keys to Julian's private safe. When they realized that Julian had locked everything down tight, and that I was the only person with the biometric access and the legal authority to move a single cent, their comforting behavior shifted. They started suggesting that maybe I was too fragile to be living alone. They started forgetting to give me my mail and then claiming I was losing my mind when I asked where it was. They even called my therapist behind my back, trying to fish for a diagnosis of complicated grief or clinical instability. The breaking point came about 2 months after the funeral. I walked into the kitchen to find my father on the phone with Julian's bank trying to impersonate an executor. When I confronted him, he didn't even look ashamed. He looked at me with this cold, hard expression and said, "Look at you, Sarah. You're a mess. You're barely functioning. You're going to blow through this money or lose it to some scammer. We're your parents. We know what's best. We've already spoken to a lawyer, and we think it's best if we're appointed as your legal guardians and the conservators of the estate." I was floored. I told them to get out of my house immediately. But as they left, my mother turned back and said, "We're doing this for your own good, sweetheart. You'll thank us when you're better." A week later, I was served with court papers. They were suing for emergency conservatorship, claiming I was mentally unfit due to severe trauma and was incapable of managing my own affairs. They had even managed to get a statement from a disgruntled former housekeeper who claimed she saw me talking to walls and neglecting my basic hygiene. It was a coordinated, disgusting character assassination. So that's where things stood. I was a widow, still crying every night, facing a legal battle against my own flesh and blood who wanted to treat me like a child so they could spend Julian's hard-earned money. I had to make a choice. Do I retreat and try to settle with them just to make the pain stop? Or do I use the weapons Julian left for me and go to war? Before I tell you about the absolute bloodbath that happened in that courtroom, I want you to pause right now and head to the comments. If your own parents told a judge you were crazy just to get their hands on your bank account, what would be your first move? Would you try to forgive them, or would you cut them out of your life forever? I really want to see your takes on this, because what happened next is something I still can't believe I had the strength to do. The day of the hearing arrived, and my parents showed up looking like the picture of concerned, grieving elders. My mother was wearing black, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and my father was wearing a suit Julian had bought him, looking somber and professional. Their lawyer stood up and gave a 30-minute opening statement about how I was unraveling, how I had abandoned my responsibilities, and how the fragility of the female psyche in the wake of such a loss required the steady hand of her parents. It was sexist, it was condescending, and it was mostly lies. They presented evidence consisting of photos of my house looking messy, photos they had taken themselves after intentionally tossing the living room, and testimonies from friends who I hadn't spoken to in years. When it was my turn, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat there with my lawyer, who was one of Julian's former partners and a man who took this betrayal very personally. We didn't just defend me, we went on the offensive. First, we produced the annual psychological evaluations Julian had insisted on. The most recent one was conducted just 1 month before his accident, proving I was in perfect mental health. Then, we produced a second evaluation I had secretly undergone the week after I was served with the papers, performed by the head of psychiatry at the state university. Both reports were glowing. But the real checkmate was the evidence Julian and I had gathered years prior. You see, Julian had installed a high-tech security system in our home that recorded audio and video in the common areas, something my parents knew about but had clearly forgotten in their greed. We played a video from the week after the funeral. In the video, you can clearly see my mother and father sitting at my dining table while I was upstairs sleeping. My father is heard saying, "If we can just get her on some heavier meds, she'll be totally out of it, and the judge will sign over the estate in a heartbeat." My mother responds, "I already looked up the house in the Hamptons. Once we sell that, we can finally retire in style. She doesn't need that much space anyway." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge looked at my parents with a look of pure disgust, but we weren't done. My lawyer then presented the poison pill clause in Julian's will. He read it aloud. In the event that Marcus and Alina last name attempt to challenge the distribution of this estate, or attempt to seek legal control over my wife, Sarah, through any means, any and all previous provisions for their financial support, including the monthly stipend and the lease on their current residence, shall be terminated immediately and permanently. They are to be barred from all properties owned by the estate and shall receive 0 cents from my legacy. My parents' faces went from a smug, "we're winning" look to a ghostly, pale white. They hadn't read the fine print of the trust because they didn't have access to it, and they assumed Julian would have provided for them regardless. They were wrong. The judge denied their petition for conservatorship on the spot. Not only that, but he also issued a stern warning about potential perjury charges regarding the evidence they had manufactured. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Because the clause was triggered the moment they filed the lawsuit, their monthly check stopped that afternoon. The lease on the luxury condo Julian had been paying for was in the estate's name, and I gave them exactly 48 hours to vacate. They called me, sobbing, screaming, calling me a monster, and then calling me their sweet daughter in the same breath, begging for mercy. They told me they were going to be homeless. I told them they should have thought about that before they tried to have me committed to a psych ward for a paycheck. I haven't spoken to them since. I sold the big house because it had too many memories, and I moved into this apartment. I'm using a portion of the estate to start a foundation in Julian's name that provides legal aid to widows who are being taken advantage of by predatory family members. I lost my husband, and in a way, I lost my parents too, but I realized that they were never really mine to begin with. They were just people who shared my DNA and saw me as a commodity. Julian's last gift to me wasn't the money. It was the protection he put in place because he knew me better than I knew myself. The moral of this story is that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones you have to guard yourself against the hardest. Grief is a vulnerability, and there are people, even family, who will see that vulnerability as an opportunity. If someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time and always, always keep a paper trail. If you think I was right to cut them off and trigger the poison pill clause, hit that like button right now. I don't feel a shred of guilt, but I'd love to hear if you think I should have been more charitable, given they are my parents. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about standing up to toxic family and getting the justice you deserve. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far, or did they get exactly what they deserved? I'll see you all in the next story.